At 10:30 a.m. on October 30th, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Herschel Albert Smith stood on the torn flight deck of the USS Enterprise at Noumea, New Caledonia. Sparks flew as Seabees welded new steel over bomb craters that should have ended the ship's story 4 days earlier. The air smelled of burnt metal and oil, and Smith knew every sound by heart: the clang of hammers, the hiss of torches, the heartbeat of a ship that refused to die. The carrier below his boots was Enterprise, CV-6, 25,000 tons of steel and history in the making. 824 feet from bow to stern, she was the pride of the United States Navy, and by that autumn of 1942, she was the only operational American carrier left in the Pacific. Just days earlier, Enterprise had survived the Battle of Santa Cruz, 2 direct bomb hits, 75 wounded, 44 dead. Her forward elevator jammed. A massive bulge ran along her starboard hull where near misses had buckled the plates. One of her fuel tanks still leaked into the sea. According to every Navy regulation, she was unfit for combat. She needed months in dry dock, but there were no other ships. The situation was that dire. The carrier Lexington had been lost at Coral Sea. Yorktown had gone down at Midway. Wasp was sunk by a torpedo 2 months earlier. Hornet had gone under just 4 days before at Santa Cruz. Saratoga was laid up in Pearl Harbor, still being patched from a torpedo hit. That left only one: Enterprise, the last carrier standing between the Imperial Japanese Navy and total control of the Solomon Islands. Japanese intelligence knew it too. They had declared Enterprise sunk 3 separate times in the past 10 months: after Eastern Solomons, after Santa Cruz. After every fight, she somehow survived. Yet every time the propaganda hit the airwaves, every time Tokyo radio announced her destruction, the Big E came back, bruised, scarred, limping but alive. It was the enemy who gave her the nickname she would carry forever: the Grey Ghost, the ship that refused to die. Herschel Smith had been with her since April 1942, serving as Damage Control Officer, a quiet, technical title that hid the truth of his role. He was the man who decided, in moments of chaos, whether Enterprise lived or died. Smith was a Naval Academy graduate, class of 1922, from Michigan. He was trained as a line officer, qualified to command ships. But his real gift was understanding how they worked, how steel bent, how heat traveled, how fire spread through compartments, how pressure tore through bulkheads. He could look at a blueprint and see the living thing beneath it. And more importantly, when he closed his eyes, he could picture every corridor, every frame, every pump and wire aboard Enterprise. By 1942, that knowledge made him invaluable, because Enterprise had been through hell. When the first bomb hit during the Battle of the Eastern Solomons in August, Smith was on the bridge. He didn't wait for reports. He ran straight into the smoke and chaos, shouting orders that cut through the confusion like a lifeline. He directed teams to shore up bulkheads, reroute power, fight fires. Within minutes, they had contained the damage. The ship stayed afloat. Then came Santa Cruz. October 26th. The Japanese struck again waves of dive bombers and torpedo planes. In less than 5 minutes, Enterprise took 2 direct bomb hits and 2 near misses. The first blast knocked Smith off his feet. The second nearly deafened him. But he kept moving. Smoke filled the passageways. Men screamed. Some were trapped. Some were on fire. And Smith, bruised, half-blinded, gave the same calm, precise orders as always. Cut that power line. Close those hatches. Pump this compartment. Move those wounded. His men didn't hesitate. They trusted him completely. Every sailor on Enterprise's damage control teams had drilled under Smith's relentless command fire drills, flooding drills, bomb damage drills day and night, calm seas and storm. They drilled until every motion was instinct, until chaos itself felt familiar. That was why they survived. By the time the fires were out and the ship's wounded carried below, Enterprise should have been finished. But Smith refused to give up. Within hours, his teams were cutting away twisted steel, sealing holes with concrete and timber, rigging pumps from scavenged parts. When the carrier limped back to Noumea, she was still bleeding oil into the water, but she was alive. Now, standing on the flight deck 4 days later, Smith watched as 75 Seabees worked through the tropical heat to make her battle-ready again. The Seabees were construction men, welders, carpenters, mechanics, not sailors. But they had something in common with Smith. They didn't believe in the word impossible. They burned through hundreds of welding rods, patched the flight deck with fresh steel, rigged the broken elevator with cables and pulleys, and reinforced the buckled hull. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't regulation. But it worked. Every hour mattered. Guadalcanal was hanging by a thread. Marines were fighting to hold Henderson Field, their only airstrip. Japanese warships were gathering to blast them off the island. The only carrier capable of providing air support was the battered, half-repaired Enterprise. That was when the order came. She had to sail. On the evening of November 10th, Captain Osborne Bennett Hardison, the new commanding officer, only 10 days into the job, received his orders. Japanese battleships were on the move. Henderson Field was the target. The Marines would not survive without air cover. Hardison, a 9-year-old Naval Academy graduate from North Carolina, read the message in silence. Then he looked across the ready room at Smith. "Can she fight?" he asked. Smith told him the truth. The forward elevator was jammed. The hull still leaked. Some compartments couldn't be fully sealed. If she took another bomb in the bow, she might go under in minutes. But her engines worked. Her steering worked. She could launch planes. She could fight. That was all Hardison needed to hear. Then we sail at dawn. When Enterprise slipped her moorings at 0600 on November 11th, welders were still working on her deck. The sound of air hammers echoed through the dawn mist. Sparks flew into the sea as the Seabees refused to stop their repairs. The ship moved slowly at first, her engines rumbling like an old fighter shaking off the pain of its last battle. Then she turned toward open water. Behind her, a thin trail of oil spread out in the harbour, the scar of a ship that had taken every hit and somehow stayed afloat. Ahead of her lay Guadalcanal, the fiercest fight yet, and the final chance to stop Japan's advance across the Pacific. The men aboard Enterprise knew what it meant. They were the last American carrier force left between the enemy and the rest of the Pacific Fleet. If they failed, there would be nothing left to hold the line until the new carriers Essex, Independence, and their sisters were ready months later. But no one said that out loud. They didn't have to. Every man who stepped onto her deck that morning felt it a quiet certainty that this ship, this battered ghost of steel and courage, would carry them through. They had seen her burn, bleed, and survive. They had seen her rise from each battle when every rule said she should have sunk. And now, as Enterprise pointed her bow toward the Solomons once more, every man aboard understood that history itself was holding its breath. In that moment, the Enterprise stopped being just a ship. She became a promise that no matter how bad things got, America would not quit. She would fight, and she would keep fighting, even if she had to do it while still under repair. Because sometimes in war, that's what victory looks like. A ship with scars, a crew with no options left, and a damage control officer standing on a flight deck, staring into the horizon ready to risk everything one more time. The last carrier standing. The grey ghost. The ship that refused to die. When people talk about the heroes of World War II, they usually name the admirals and the pilots, the men whose pictures made the papers and whose words made the headlines. But the truth is, many of the Navy's greatest victories came down to men no one ever heard of. On the USS Enterprise, that man was Lieutenant Commander Herschel Albert Smith. Smith didn't look like the image of a war hero. He was 42 years old in 1942, solidly built, quiet, methodical. He didn't give speeches or bark orders for effect. When he spoke, men listened not because he was loud, but because he always knew exactly what to do. In battle, that calm confidence meant everything. He had graduated from the U.S. Naval Academy in 1922. 2 decades in uniform had made him one of those officers who could walk through any ship blindfolded and still know where he was. He started as a line officer trained to command, but found his true calling in damage control. At a time when most officers wanted to fire guns or fly planes, Smith studied the bones of ships. How they were built, how steel fractured, how pressure moved through bulkheads, how fire traveled through ventilation ducts. He knew what could kill a ship and how to stop it. By April 1942, when Smith reported aboard Enterprise as damage control officer, the carrier had already been in combat at the Marshalls and the Doolittle raid. She was a veteran ship with a veteran crew, but war in the Pacific was changing fast. Carriers were becoming the heart of the fleet, and the Japanese had shown they knew how to hit them hard. Smith understood something few officers did. No matter how powerful a ship was, it only lived as long as it could control damage. So he trained his men to do what few others could. Every day on Enterprise was a lesson. Fires on the flight deck, flooding drills below, explosions simulated in the hangar bay. His teams learned to react before fear could even register. He drilled them in daylight and darkness, in calm seas and rough weather, until every sailor could find his equipment blindfolded, until muscle memory replaced panic. The sound of alarms no longer froze them, it triggered action. Smith demanded precision, but he also earned loyalty. He worked alongside his men, sweating through the drills, crawling through the ship's guts with them. He could fix a pump, splice a cable, swing an axe to cut through a jammed hatch. The sailors trusted him because he never asked them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. That training paid off on August 24th, 1942, the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. The Japanese had found Enterprise. Dive bombers screamed out of the clouds, their sirens wailing. The first bomb hit near the after elevator, punching through the flight deck and detonating deep inside the ship. The explosion tore open 3 decks, killed dozens, and started fires in the hangar bay. Power went out, alarms howled, the ship's intercom went dead. Smith didn't wait for damage reports. He ran straight toward the smoke. Below decks, sailors were already fighting to contain fires with hoses and extinguishers. Some compartments were filled with choking black smoke. He moved through the chaos like a man who could see through walls, checking bulkheads, feeling for heat, judging where the fire would spread next. His men followed, stringing hoses, carrying wounded sailors, cutting away wreckage. Smith's orders came fast and clear. Shore up this bulkhead, get foam on that deck, reroute power through this circuit, seal that hatch now. Every command had purpose. Every action bought them another minute of life. He knew that if fire reached the fuel lines, the ship would be lost. He knew exactly which compartments to flood and which to keep dry. Within an hour, the fires were contained. The ship was hurt, but she was still fighting. When it was over, one officer said Smith's calm had been the difference between an emergency and a catastrophe. 2 months later, it happened again, worse this time. October 26th, 1942, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. The Japanese came in waves, dive bombers from above, torpedo planes from below. Within minutes, Enterprise took 2 direct bomb hits and 2 near misses. The first explosion rocked the ship. The second knocked Smith to the deck, his ears ringing, vision blurred. When he staggered to his feet, the passageway around him was filled with smoke. Men were screaming. Power cables hung from the overhead, sparking like lightning. Most men would have frozen. Smith didn't. He grabbed the nearest sailor and shouted orders: "Clear the wounded, kill the power to that section, close the watertight doors." Then he sprinted toward the forward compartments, where damage reports were already coming in over the sound-powered phones. Fires were spreading below the flight deck. Flooding had started in multiple spaces. He moved fast, making decisions by instinct and experience. Pump this compartment, seal that bulkhead, move those men aft. His voice carried through the noise like an anchor in a storm. The situation was critical. The second bomb had detonated deep inside the ship, rupturing fuel lines and setting fires in the hangar deck. Nearby compartments began to flood from the concussive force. If those fires reached the magazines where ammunition was stored, it would be over. But Smith's training showed. His teams sealed off the compartments, rerouted ventilation, and fought the fires in suffocating heat and smoke. They crawled on hands and knees through knee-deep water, hauling hoses and axes, some wearing gas masks, others too busy to bother. Sailors carried the wounded out of burning compartments. The sound of explosions was constant. Still, the pumps kept running, the hoses kept spraying. They held the line. By midnight, the fires were out. Enterprise was bleeding and blackened, but still alive. The Japanese had claimed her sunk again that night. Tokyo radio broadcast the victory to the world. But the next morning, she was still there, limping toward Noumea under her own power. When the carrier reached port, her decks looked like a patchwork of craters. Yet even as the wounded were being carried off, Smith was already back at work, supervising repairs, cataloguing damage, directing the Seabees who had come aboard to help. He knew the Navy couldn't afford to lose her. There was no time to wait for shipyards or engineers. He improvised with what he had: concrete patches, makeshift bracing, cables and wooden plugs to seal holes. He slept 2 hours a night, sometimes less. Every weld was checked, every bulkhead inspected. The shipyard workers who came aboard said later they'd never seen an officer move so fast or think so clearly under pressure. It wasn't glamorous work. There were no medals for patching holes. But the truth was simple. Without Smith, Enterprise would have gone under long before Guadalcanal. When the order came to sail again, barely 2 weeks after Santa Cruz, Smith knew what it meant. The ship wasn't ready, the repairs weren't complete, but there were no alternatives. Henderson Field was under threat, and Enterprise was the only carrier left to protect it. He didn't hesitate. He checked his teams, reviewed their equipment, and made sure every man knew his station. "We'll get hit again," he told them. "Be ready." And they were. By then, every sailor in the damage control division trusted him completely. They'd seen what he could do, seen him walk through fire, crawl into flooded compartments, and make decisions that saved hundreds of lives. Smith didn't talk about bravery. He didn't need to. His men followed him because they knew he'd never leave them behind. In the Navy's after-action reports, his name appeared only in passing. Lieutenant Commander H.A. Smith, Damage Control Officer, performed his duties in a highly efficient manner. That was all. But the sailors aboard Enterprise knew better. They knew that whenever the Japanese claimed their ship was gone, Smith was the reason she came back. He didn't win medals, he didn't make headlines, but every plate welded, every bulkhead sealed, every fire put out bore his fingerprints. He was the man who kept the grey ghost alive. Later, when Captain Hardison would look back on those desperate days before Guadalcanal, he said it best. If that ship could think, she'd thank Smith first. Because in the chaos of the Pacific War, where luck and courage often decided who lived and who sank, Enterprise had both. But more than anything, she had a man who refused to let her die. By the time the USS Enterprise reached Noumea in late October 1942, she looked more like a wounded whale than the most feared ship in the Pacific. Her flight deck was torn open in multiple places. The forward elevator was jammed halfway between decks, twisted from the shock of the bomb blast. Fires had scorched the hangar bay. The hull bulged outward along the starboard side where near misses had caved in plates. She was leaking fuel oil from ruptured tanks. In any normal war, a ship in that condition would have gone straight to a major shipyard, Pearl Harbor, Bremerton, or Mare Island for months of repairs. But the Pacific War wasn't normal. It was November 1942, and the United States had no other operational carriers left to fight. The Lexington was gone, sunk at Coral Sea. Yorktown was gone, lost at Midway. Wasp had gone down in September. Hornet was destroyed just 4 days before at Santa Cruz. Saratoga was in Pearl Harbor under repair from a torpedo hit. That left Enterprise battered, burning, but still alive. She was all the US Navy had left between the Japanese and total control of the Solomon Islands. So instead of a shipyard, she got something different. 75 men from the Navy's brand new construction battalions, the Seabees. The Seabees were not combat sailors. They were welders, carpenters, mechanics, and engineers pulled from civilian life and thrown into uniform. They built runways, piers, and bases, anything the Navy needed, anywhere in the world. Now, for the first time, they were being asked to do something no Seabee unit had ever done before: patch up an aircraft carrier under combat conditions. Lieutenant Commander Herschel Smith, Enterprise's damage control officer, met them at the dock. He looked over their gear welding torches, cutting rigs, cranes, planks, and steel plates, and told them exactly what they were going to do. There was no time for pleasantries. The Japanese Navy was regrouping, and everyone knew another battle was coming soon. For 4 straight days, Noumea echoed with the sound of repairs. The Seabees worked in 3 shifts around the clock. Welders crouched along the torn flight deck, sparks flying against the tropical night. Carpenters shaped wooden plugs to fit jagged holes below the waterline. Mechanics and riggers tore into the elevator machinery, trying to realign the jammed platform with jury-rigged pulleys and cables. The temperature inside the hangar deck reached 120 degrees. The smell of hot steel and oil filled the air. Men worked stripped to their waists, covered in sweat and grime. Whenever a piece of steel cooled, Smith inspected the welds himself. He knew that in a few days these temporary fixes would be tested by bombs and torpedoes. If any one of them failed, the ship could be lost. The Seabees were not sailors, but they understood work. They didn't complain. They didn't quit. Smith gave them targets. They figured out how to make them happen. Within 2 days, the biggest holes in the flight deck were sealed with thick steel patches. The buckled hull was reinforced from the inside, with steel beams braced against interior frames. Fuel lines were rerouted. Temporary electric circuits replaced damaged ones. It wasn't regulation. It wasn't pretty. But it worked. Meanwhile, below decks, Smith's damage control teams overhauled pumps, sealed compartments, and replaced firefighting equipment lost at Santa Cruz. They drilled again: fire, flooding, electrical failure, until the response was automatic. If Enterprise was going to sea again, everyone had to be ready. And then, on November 10th, the message came in. Japanese battleships were steaming south toward Guadalcanal. Their mission: bombard Henderson Field, wipe out the Marine Air Base, and pave the way for reinforcements to retake the island. Admiral William Bull Halsey's order was simple: Enterprise must sortie at once. The ship wasn't ready. Everyone knew it. Repairs were incomplete. The forward elevator was still jammed, the hull still leaking, the patches still cooling. But there were no alternatives. Without Enterprise, there would be no air cover for the Marines holding the line on Guadalcanal. Captain Osborne Bennett Hardison, who had been in command for barely 10 days, stared at the damage reports. Then he looked at Smith. "Can she fight?" he asked. Smith didn't sugarcoat it. "If we take another bomb forward, those plates may not hold. If we take a torpedo in the starboard hull, she'll flood faster than the pumps can manage. The elevator's still unreliable." Hardison nodded slowly. "But can she fight?" "Yes, sir," Smith said. "She can fight." That was all Hardison needed. At dawn on November 11th, Enterprise's engines rumbled to life. The Seabees were still aboard, still welding, hammering, tightening bolts as the ship eased out of Noumea harbor. Sparks flew from the deck as welders refused to stop their work. Air hammers rattled in the background while lookouts scanned the horizon. It was an extraordinary sight, a warship heading into battle while still under repair. As the Enterprise cleared the harbor, a thin line of oil spread behind her. The patched hull still leaked slightly, but it didn't matter. She was moving again. The men aboard, the sailors, the Seabees, and the air crews knew they were heading into one of the most desperate moments of the Pacific War. Up above, the carrier's Air Group 10 was rebuilding. The Grim Reapers of VF-10 had lost half their pilots at Santa Cruz. Bombing Squadron 10 and Torpedo Squadron 10 were under strength, many of their aircraft patched with scavenged parts. But morale was high. They were the last airmen left to fight. Below decks, Smith ran final drills with his damage control teams. He knew the ship's weaknesses better than anyone. The newly welded plates near the bow could buckle under another near miss. The elevator's cables could snap if a bomb hit close. But he also knew something else. His men had done the impossible before. They could do it again. On November 12th, Enterprise joined American surface forces east of Guadalcanal. The Japanese were on the move. At 9 a.m., her dive bombers found the heavy cruiser Kinugasa retreating northwest after bombarding Henderson Field. The attack was textbook. From 12,000 feet, the dauntless dive bombers rolled into their dives, bomb doors open, screaming toward the target. At 9:36 a.m., the first bomb hit. The explosion ripped through Kinugasa's forward gasoline storage, killing her captain instantly. The second wave struck minutes later. Within an hour, the cruiser was burning from bow to stern. At 1:45 p.m., she capsized and sank. 511 of her crew went down with her. It was Enterprise's first strike since Santa Cruz, and it proved she was still deadly. But Smith wasn't watching the air war. He was below decks, checking compartments for leaks, making sure the temporary patches were holding under strain. Every time the ship launched or recovered aircraft, the deck flexed under the weight. Every time she turned hard to recover planes, stress shifted through her repaired frame. He inspected welds with his own eyes, ran his hands over newly reinforced bulkheads, listened to pumps, checked valves. He trusted his teams, but he trusted verification more. By nightfall, word spread that the Japanese had committed battleships Hiei and Kirishima to attack Henderson Field. The coming days would bring one of the fiercest naval battles of the war, the Battle of Guadalcanal, and Enterprise, still half-patched and leaking, would be at the center of it. The Seabees kept working even as the ship steamed toward the combat zone. Their torches lit up the night as they reinforced the hull and welded braces around the elevator shaft. Some men worked in total darkness, guided only by flashlights and the vibration of engines under their boots. When sailors tried to tell them to rest, they refused. "We'll sleep when she's fixed," one said. For 4 days, Enterprise operated like that half shipyard, half warship launching planes from a deck where welders still crouched under canvas screens to block the glare. The rhythm of the ship was surreal. The roar of aircraft catapults by day, the crackle of welding torches by night. And through it all, Herschel Smith moved like a man wired to the heartbeat of the ship. He didn't shout, didn't boast, didn't stop. He checked every team, every compartment, every system. He knew Enterprise was still vulnerable, but he also knew that the fight for Guadalcanal would decide the future of the war in the Pacific. On November 13th and 14th, her aircraft helped finish Hiei and destroyed Japanese troop convoys trying to reinforce the island. By the time she returned to Noumea on November 16th, Enterprise was stronger than when she had left. The Seabees had done it. The ship had been repaired while fighting something no other carrier in history had ever achieved. In the Navy dispatches that followed, Captain Hardison gave credit where it was due. The emergency repairs accomplished by this skillful, well-trained and enthusiastically energetic force have placed this vessel in condition for further action against the enemy. Admiral Halsey himself sent a personal message to the Seabees. "Your commander wishes to express his appreciation for the services rendered by you in effecting emergency repairs during action against the enemy. The repairs were completed with speed and efficiency. I hereby commend you for your willingness, zeal, and capability." For most of those men, it was the only recognition they ever received. They went back to building bases and runways, never imagining that the work they did in those 4 days had helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Because those 4 days, those sleepless, fiery, oil-stained days had kept Enterprise alive, and by keeping her alive, they kept the dream of victory alive too. The ship that should have been in dry dock had fought, and won, while still under repair. No one had ever seen anything like it, and history would never forget it. At dawn on November 12th, 1942, the Enterprise steamed through grey seas 200 miles southeast of Guadalcanal. Her patched hull groaned under pressure. Her flight deck still bore the scars of Santa Cruz, and welders were still hammering plates in the hangar bay. But for the first time in weeks, the ship was fully operational enough to do what she was built for: launch planes into battle. The mission was simple: protect the Marines holding Henderson Field and stop the Japanese Navy from taking Guadalcanal. The reality was anything but simple. Enterprise was the only functioning American carrier in the Pacific. She carried the last working air group capable of striking at sea. If she failed, if she were sunk, the Solomon Islands would fall, and with them, perhaps the war's balance in the Pacific. That morning, word came in from reconnaissance. Japanese forces were approaching from the northwest. The heavy cruiser Kinugasa was retreating after bombarding Henderson Field the previous night. She was fast, heavily armed, and believed to be clear of danger. She was wrong. At 0900 hours, Enterprise launched her first strike since Santa Cruz. 9 SBD Dauntless dive bombers from Bombing Squadron 10, escorted by a handful of F-4F Wildcat fighters. They climbed into a broken sky and set course toward the Solomon Sea. At 9:36 a.m., the Dauntlesses found Kinugasa 150 miles northwest of Guadalcanal. The cruiser's lookouts barely had time to shout warnings before the Americans rolled into their dives. From 12,000 feet, the bombers dropped straight down, their dive brakes shrieking through the wind. The Japanese gunners opened up, but the Dauntlesses were already locked on target. The first 500-pound bomb hit forward of the bridge, igniting the gasoline storage tanks. A second bomb smashed through the deck near the engine rooms. A third struck amidships, killing Captain Sawa and much of his bridge crew instantly. The explosions ripped through compartments, flooding the lower decks and setting the ship ablaze. A second wave of bombers finished the job. Within minutes, Kinugasa was dead in the water, listing hard to port, her superstructure engulfed in fire. At 1:45 p.m., she capsized and sank, taking 511 of her crew with her. When the Dauntlesses returned to Enterprise, their pilots were exhausted but exultant. The grey ghost had struck again. But there was no time to celebrate. New reports were coming in bigger, more dangerous ones. Japanese battleships Hiei and Kirishima, escorted by cruisers and destroyers, were steaming south from the Shortland Islands. Their orders were clear. Bombard Henderson Field, wipe out the Marine Air Base, and pave the way for 11 troop transports carrying 10,000 soldiers to land and retake Guadalcanal. The American response was desperate. Admiral Callahan assembled every ship he could, cruisers and destroyers, many with inexperienced crews, and sent them north to intercept the Japanese force. Enterprise would provide air cover, but the night would belong to the surface ships. Just after 8:30 a.m. on November 13th, the two fleets collided in the dark near Savo Island. It was chaos, an all-out brawl at point-blank range. Searchlights stabbed through the rain as the ships fired blindly at each other. The range was so close that shells passed straight through some ships without detonating. The Japanese battleship Hiei, bristling with 8 14-inch guns, opened fire at near-zero range, but American destroyers rushed her head-on, launching torpedoes and raking her with gunfire. One by one, both sides' ships were hit, burned, and sank. By dawn, dozens of ships were crippled or gone. When the sun rose, Hiei was still afloat but barely. Her steering was shot out, her engines crippled, her superstructure shattered. She drifted northwest of Savo Island, circling helplessly at 8 knots, smoke pouring from her decks. Her crew was still aboard, trying to make repairs, unaware that death was coming from above. At 6:15 a.m., Enterprise launched her first strike of the day: 6 F-4F Wildcats, 9 SBD Dauntlesses, and 6 TBF Avengers. They found Hiei 40 minutes later, limping north under the escort of 3 destroyers. Her big guns still pointed skyward, defiant. But she couldn't maneuver. The dive bombers rolled in from 10,000 feet. The first bomb hit near the forward turret. The second exploded midship. Fire swept across her deck. Then came the torpedo planes, skimming low at 200 feet, engines roaring, tracers slicing through the air. The Avengers dropped their Mark 13 torpedoes at 1,500 yards. 2 ran true, slamming into Hiei's port side with thunderous underwater explosions. The battleship shuddered, slowed, and began to list. Her escorts fired back desperately but couldn't keep the American planes away. Within minutes, Marine aircraft from Henderson Field joined the attack dive bombers, torpedo planes, even Army B-17 seconds from Espiritu Santo dropping bombs from 20,000 feet. It was an all-service assault, the Navy, the Marines, the Army all hitting one target. Wave after wave pummeled the Hiei. By mid-afternoon, she had taken between 5 and 8 bomb hits and at least as many torpedoes. Fires burned uncontrollably from bow to stern. Water poured into her lower decks. By sunset, she was dead in the water, her crew abandoning ship. At 6:15 p.m., the Japanese scuttled Hiei with demolition charges. She sank slowly into the dark waters northwest of Savo Island. 838 men went down with her. The Enterprise's pilots returned home in the fading light. Many were too exhausted to climb from their cockpits. They'd been flying almost non-stop for 3 days. Some had already survived Santa Cruz, flown through storms, and fought through anti-aircraft fire that seemed to fill the sky. Yet they went out again and again. For them, it wasn't about medals or glory. It was survival for their ship, for their friends, for the men on Guadalcanal who needed them. That night, November 14th into the 15th, the Japanese sent another force south. 4 cruisers, 9 destroyers, and the battleship Kirishima. Their mission: finish what Hia couldn't. Bombard Henderson Field into ruin and protect the troop convoy steaming behind them. But waiting for them in Iron Bottom Sound were the battleships Washington and South Dakota, the first U.S. capital ships to fight at night with radar-guided fire control. The 2 fleets met just before midnight. Kirishima's guns found South Dakota and pounded her with shell fire, knocking out communications and power. But when she turned to fire on Washington, she exposed herself. The American battleship's radar found her instantly. From 8,400 yards point-blank range for a battleship, Washington opened fire with her 16-inch guns. The result was annihilation. Hit after hit smashed through Kirishima's armor. Fire engulfed her decks. Ammunition exploded below. The ship rolled, burning, her great guns still pointing uselessly at the sky. By dawn, the Japanese scuttled her too. 2 battleships in 3 days, High A and Kirishima gone. While the big guns thundered at night, the Grey Ghost kept fighting by day. On November 14th, Enterprise's air group found the 11 Japanese troop transports carrying 10,000 soldiers south toward Guadalcanal. Each ship was loaded with artillery, tanks, ammunition, food, and medicine, everything needed to retake the island. They never made it. At 8:30 a.m., Enterprise dive bombers attacked from 12,000 feet. The first bombs turned the Kinugawa Maru into a fireball, splitting her in half. By mid-morning, more Dauntlesses and Avengers arrived, joined by Marine aircraft from Henderson Field and Army B-17 seconds from Espiritu Santo. They struck relentlessly. The Canberra Maru, Brisbane Maru, Nagara Maru, Nuko Maru, Shinanogawa Maru, all hit, all burning. By mid-afternoon, 7 of the 11 transports were gone, sinking in deep water with thousands of soldiers trapped below decks. The survivors clung to wreckage, floating helplessly in the sea. The 4 remaining transports pressed on through the night, burning as they went. Their captains knew they were doomed, but they tried to beach their ships at Tassafaronga to unload troops before sinking. At dawn on November 15th, they ran themselves aground. The soldiers waded ashore, but without weapons, without supplies, without hope. Of 10,000 men who had set out, fewer than 2,000 reached land armed and ready to fight. The rest were lost to the sea. By the time the sun rose that morning, the Battle of Guadalcanal was over. The Japanese Navy had lost 2 battleships, 1 heavy cruiser, 3 destroyers, and 7 troop transports. The Americans had lost 2 light cruisers and 7 destroyers, but they had held the island. Henderson Field still stood. The Marines were bloodied but unbroken, and the ship that had made it all possible, the Enterprise, sailed away battered, scarred, and victorious once more. Captain Hardison's message to the Navy Department was brief but perfect. The emergency repairs accomplished by this skillful, well-trained, and enthusiastically energetic force have placed this vessel in condition for further action against the enemy. That was military understatement for what had just happened. The Enterprise, the ship that should have been in dry dock, had fought 4 days of continuous combat while still under repair. And in those 4 days, she helped sink 2 battleships, a cruiser, and 7 transports. She helped save Guadalcanal. She helped turn the war. The Japanese never again mounted a major offensive on Guadalcanal. By February 1943, they were evacuating their remaining troops under cover of darkness. The tide had turned, and it had turned on the back of one battered carrier, her repair crews, and the men who refused to let her die. For the Americans who served aboard her, those days in November became legend. They had seen what faith, skill, and courage could do. They had watched their ship fight like a living thing, patched, bleeding but unbroken. The Enterprise had lived up to her name. The Grey Ghost had done it again. And from that moment forward, every sailor in the Pacific knew one thing for certain. As long as Enterprise was afloat, America still had a fighting chance. When the guns finally fell silent over Guadalcanal on November 15, 1942, the ocean was littered with wreckage and oil slicks that stretched for miles. Ships burned down to the waterline. Bodies floated among life rafts. The waves carried fragments of both navies, steel, wood, and human stories. The Battle of Guadalcanal had ended, and the cost was staggering. For the Japanese, it was a disaster they could never fully recover from. For the Americans, it was the turning point the moment the tide of war in the Pacific began to shift. And at the heart of that change was one ship, the USS Enterprise, the battered carrier that had fought 4 days of continuous battle while still under repair. Those 4 days, November 12th through 15th, reshaped the entire Pacific campaign. The aftermath. In the space of 96 hours, the Japanese Navy had lost 2 battleships, Hiei and Kirishima, 1 heavy cruiser, Kinugasa, 3 destroyers, and 7 troop transports. Thousands of Japanese sailors and soldiers were dead. The convoy that had been meant to retake Guadalcanal was annihilated before it could even reach shore. The few transports that managed to beach themselves had landed soldiers without food, ammunition, or heavy weapons. The 38th Division troops, hardened veterans from China, were now stranded on an island where they could not be resupplied. For the Americans, the losses were painful but bearable. 2 light cruisers, 7 destroyers, and hundreds of men were gone. But Henderson Field still stood. The Marines had held the island, and the Enterprise, against all odds, was still afloat. When she returned to Noumea on November 16th, her decks were covered with soot and scorch marks. The welders who had worked non-stop for 10 days looked like ghosts' faces blackened with grime, uniforms stiff with sweat and oil. But their work had held. The patched hull had survived combat. The damaged elevator had stayed intact. The Grey Ghost had done the impossible again. Hardison's report. Captain Osborne Bennett Hardison sent his after-action report to the Navy Department that same day. It was one of the most understated dispatches in naval history. The emergency repairs accomplished by this skillful, well-trained and enthusiastically energetic force have placed this vessel in condition for further action against the enemy. That single sentence said everything and nothing. It was the kind of quiet professionalism that defined the Navy. No dramatics, no fanfare, just a statement of fact. We fought, we survived. We're ready to fight again. But the truth was extraordinary. Enterprise had fought through 4 straight days of combat while 75 Seabees and a full repair crew were still working aboard her. Welders had burned through electrode rods by the hundreds. Mechanics had crawled through the ship's machinery while the engines turned beneath them. Carpenters had reinforced bomb patches, even as the carrier launched planes overhead. They had done their jobs with bombs falling in the distance. When the fighting ended, Admiral William F. Halsey, commander of the South Pacific, sent a personal message to the Seabees who had worked aboard Enterprise. Your commander wishes to express to you and the men of the construction battalion his appreciation for the services rendered by you in effecting emergency repairs during action against the enemy. The repairs were completed with speed and efficiency. I hereby commend you for your willingness, zeal, and capability. It was more than a thank you, it was recognition that the Seabees had just proven something vital. American ingenuity and determination could make up for any shortage of ships. The Grey Ghost's miracle. For Herschel Albert Smith, Enterprise's damage control officer, the victory was personal. He'd been the man responsible for holding the ship together through Santa Cruz, through Noumea, and through those desperate days off Guadalcanal, his teams had fought fires, sealed compartments, pumped out flooded spaces, and kept machinery running that should have failed days earlier. He never asked for credit, he never got it. But every man aboard knew, without Smith, Enterprise would have gone down. The Seabees returned to their construction duties after the battle. Most never spoke about what they'd done. They were builders, not soldiers. They didn't think of themselves as heroes, but history would prove them wrong, because what they achieved keeping a damaged carrier operational under combat conditions had never been done before in naval history. Even more remarkable, those repairs had directly shaped the battle's outcome. If Enterprise hadn't been able to launch aircraft on November 12th, Kinugasa might have escaped. If her planes hadn't flown on the 13th, Hiei might have survived to bombard Henderson Field. If her pilots hadn't attacked the troop convoys on the 14th, 10,000 Japanese reinforcements might have retaken the island. Every day she stayed alive, the course of the war bent a little further toward victory. The bigger picture. By late November 1942, the strategic situation had changed. For the first time since Pearl Harbor, the Japanese Navy had been decisively beaten in a major operation. The myth of Japanese invincibility was broken. The Imperial Navy had thrown everything it had at Guadalcanal, 2 battleships, 11 transports, countless aircraft, and lost it all. Their air groups were depleted. Their pilots, once the most skilled in the world, were dying faster than they could be replaced. Meanwhile, American shipyards were hitting their stride. In California and Virginia, the new Essex-class carriers were already taking shape. More destroyers, more cruisers, more submarines were sliding off the assembly lines every month. The great wave of American industrial power was about to hit the Pacific like a tsunami. But in November 1942, all of that was still in the future. In that moment, it came down to one ship, one battered, patched, leaking ship, and the men who refused to let her quit. The Enterprise had bought time. She had held the line long enough for America's factories to catch up. She had shown that courage, improvisation, and teamwork could beat numbers, training, and technology. And she had done it while half-broken. The pilot's story. For the air crews who fought from her deck, those 4 days left memories that never faded. The pilots of Air Group 10, the Grim Reapers, had flown up to 4 missions a day. They'd launched from a deck still shaking with hammer blows. They'd eaten cold sandwiches in ready rooms, slept in flight gear, and gone right back up into combat. Many of them were barely out of their teens. Some had flown through every battle since Midway. They had watched friends disappear into the sea, seen ships explode, and somehow kept flying. By November 15th, they were exhausted, but they'd earned a place in history. Their bombs and torpedoes had sunk a cruiser, 2 battleships, and 7 transports all in 4 days. It was one of the most devastating single sequences of strikes in naval aviation history. The turning point. When Enterprise anchored again at Noumea on November 16th, she was the most celebrated ship in the Navy. She had fought in every carrier battle of 1,942 except one. She had been hit 5 times, declared sunk 3 times, and survived every encounter. She was the embodiment of a navy learning to fight a new kind of war, one where mobility, air power, and speed mattered more than armor or guns. And in those November battles, the world saw the proof. The age of the battleship was over. The age of the carrier had begun. The human cost. The victory came at a price. On Enterprise alone, 44 men had been killed and 75 wounded at Santa Cruz. Others were injured during the frantic repairs and combat operations off Guadalcanal. The Seabees worked with burns and broken hands. The pilots flew with bandaged wounds. Smith's men fought fires through smoke so thick they could barely breathe. But they kept going not for medals, not for headlines, but for each other, because they knew the truth. Ships don't fight, people do. And as long as they were alive, the Enterprise was alive. A legacy forged in fire. When historians later wrote about Guadalcanal, they called it the moment when Japan's advance across the Pacific finally stopped. They called it the turning of the tide. But for the men of Enterprise, it was simpler than that. It was survival. It was duty. It was doing the job no matter the odds. They had sailed into battle with a half-repaired ship, fought through hell, and come out the other side victorious. It was a victory that proved something powerful about America itself, that the nation could take the hardest hits, adapt, rebuild, and come back stronger every time. 4 days, one ship, thousands of lives. That was the difference between defeat and hope. The Battle of Guadalcanal was over. But the legend of the Grey Ghost was just beginning. She had saved the island. She had saved the war's momentum. And she had shown the world that America, even when bloodied, would never, ever back down. When the USS Enterprise steamed back into Noumea after the Battle of Guadalcanal in November 1942, she carried more than scars, she carried a legend. The men who served aboard her had done what no one thought possible. They had taken a crippled carrier, fought 4 days of continuous combat, and helped turn the tide of the Pacific War. Word spread fast across the fleet. To sailors and pilots everywhere, Enterprise wasn't just a ship anymore. She was something else, a survivor, a symbol. The Japanese had declared her sunk 3 times in 10 months, yet she kept coming back. To them, she was the Grey Ghost. To Americans, she was proof that grit and courage could keep a nation alive. And she was far from done. A ship reborn. After Guadalcanal, Enterprise limped to Pearl Harbor for full repairs. Her decks were pitted with shrapnel scars, her hull still bulged from near misses, and her forward elevator was jammed again. But the shipyard workers in Hawaii treated her like a national treasure. They worked around the clock, refitting her systems, strengthening her armor, and repairing her flight deck. By early 1943, she was ready for sea again. Her air group had been replenished, her engines overhauled, and her crew now battle-hardened veterans trained and ready for what came next. For most of the war, Enterprise would never again fight alone. New Essex-class carriers, bigger, faster, more advanced, were joining the fleet one after another. But none had her experience, and none carried her reputation. When she returned to action in January 1943, the Navy gave her a new nickname, the Fighting Lady. She'd earned it. Back to war. In 1943, Enterprise led strikes throughout the South Pacific. She supported landings at the Gilbert and Marshall Islands, attacked Japanese strongholds at Kwajalein and Truk, and provided cover for the invasion of the Marianas. At Truk Lagoon, Japan's most powerful naval base, her aircraft helped destroy more than 200 enemy planes on the ground and sank dozens of ships in what American pilots called the Japanese Pearl Harbor. By then, her air group was one of the most skilled in the Navy. The pilots who flew from her decks were veterans of every major carrier battle since Midway. They'd seen the worst, and it showed in the precision of their flying. They moved with quiet professionalism, efficient, deadly, unstoppable. The Grey Ghost had become the Navy's workhorse. She didn't always make headlines anymore, not with new ships like Essex, Bunker Hill, and Lexington, CV-16, joining the fleet. But every time the Navy needed a reliable carrier for a tough mission, they sent Enterprise. She never failed them. The great carrier battles. By 1944, Enterprise was part of Task Force 58, the largest concentration of naval air power in history. She took part in the Marianas Campaign, the invasion of Saipan, and the Battle of the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle ever fought. It was June 1944 when hundreds of Japanese planes launched from their remaining carriers in a desperate attempt to destroy the American fleet. Enterprise's fighters met them head-on. What followed became known as the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. The Japanese pilots, poorly trained and flying outdated aircraft, were cut down in staggering numbers. In one day, American pilots shot down more than 350 enemy planes, 52 of them by Enterprise aircraft alone. The Japanese fleet lost most of its remaining air strength in a single battle. When the fight was over, Enterprise's deck crews painted tiny Japanese flags on the island structure, one for each kill. The Grey Ghost was no longer just surviving, she was leading the charge. The Philippines and Leyte Gulf. That fall, Enterprise joined the campaign to retake the Philippines. In October 1944, she fought in the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in world history. Her aircraft struck enemy carriers in the Sibuyan Sea, attacked Japanese battleships in Surigao Strait, and pounded retreating cruisers near Samar. In 4 days of fighting, Enterprise aircraft sank 3 ships, damaged many others, and helped break the back of the Japanese Navy once and for all. By then, the Japanese had started using a new, desperate weapon, the kamikaze. On October 25th, one of the suicide pilots dove toward Enterprise, aiming for her flight deck. Anti-aircraft gunners opened fire, and the plane exploded before it could hit, but everyone aboard knew this was the new face of war. The enemy was willing to die just to take them with him. From that day on, the Grey Ghost fought in a new kind of battle, one where death came from above, fast and silent. Night Warrior. Late in 1944, the Navy began experimenting with something no one had ever done before: night carrier operations. The idea was to keep American air power active 24 hours a day, hunting the enemy even after dark. Enterprise was chosen to test it. She became the first carrier equipped for full-time night operations, with radar-equipped fighters and specially trained pilots. They called themselves the Night Air Group, and their mission was to protect the fleet while the rest of the carriers rested. It was dangerous work, flying off a blacked-out deck into total darkness, trusting instruments and instinct. But it gave the Navy a new weapon, and once again Enterprise was the pioneer. By early 1945, she was the Navy's first true night carrier, the Queen of the Night. Her aircraft flew continuous missions over Iwo Jima, bombing Japanese positions and providing cover for Marines on the beaches. For 174 straight hours, 7 days, her planes were in the air. It was an endurance record no other carrier in history had matched. Okinawa and the kamikazes. Then came Okinawa. It was the last great battle of the Pacific, a brutal 3-month struggle fought under constant suicide attacks. The Japanese threw everything they had left at the American fleet. On April 11th, 1945, a kamikaze slipped through the fighter screen and dove straight into Enterprise's forward flight deck. The explosion ripped a hole through multiple decks, killing 14 men and wounding 34. Within minutes, the damage control teams, many trained by Herschel Smith years earlier, had the fires under control. The ship stayed in formation, still launching planes, still fighting. 3 weeks later, on May 14th, another kamikaze hit the same spot. The explosion destroyed the forward elevator and blew a hole through the hangar deck. 13 men were killed, 68 wounded. The damage was severe enough that Enterprise had to withdraw to Ulithi for repairs. It was the first time in 3 years she had been forced out of action by enemy fire. But she had fought through 20 major battles before this one, and even a kamikaze couldn't change that. By the time the ship was repaired, the war was nearly over. Japan surrendered in August 1945, while Enterprise was still in dry dock. She never made it to Tokyo Bay for the official ceremony, but everyone in the Navy knew she'd earned the right to be there. Her record. By war's end, The USS Enterprise had fought in 18 of the 22 major carrier battles of World War II, more than any other American ship. She had steamed 275,000 miles, shot down 911 enemy planes, sunk 71 ships, and damaged nearly 200 more. She earned 20 battle stars, more than any other ship in U.S. naval history. She received both the Presidential Unit Citation and the Navy Unit Commendation, the only carrier ever to receive both. Every man who served aboard her knew they'd been part of something rare, a fighting ship that became more than metal, more than machinery. She was the Navy's heart. The legend grows. As the fleet sailed into Tokyo Bay in September 1945, the Enterprise sat thousands of miles away in a repair dock, silent and scarred. She'd given everything she had. But even in rest, her legend was growing. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal called her the one vessel that most nearly symbolizes the history of the United States Navy in World War II. Admirals, sailors, and pilots all said the same thing. She had been the right ship, at the right place, at the right time again and again. The Grey Ghost had fought from Pearl Harbor to Okinawa, from Midway to Leyte, through fire, smoke, and loss. She had outlasted every one of her sisters, and though she would never fight again, her name was already immortal. She had proven what no one could ever doubt again, that courage, discipline, and the will to fight, even when broken, can carry a nation to victory. The Grey Ghost still sailed in the hearts of her men, and her story was far from over. Long before the world called her the Grey Ghost, the USS Enterprise was simply another ship doing her duty. On December 7th, 1941, she was supposed to be home. Her task force had been delayed by bad weather returning from Wake Island, and when her planes reached Oahu that morning, the sky over Pearl Harbor was already full of black smoke. Those aircraft scouting dauntless dive bombers flew straight into the attack. 7 were shot down by Japanese fighters or friendly anti-aircraft fire. 8 airmen died before Enterprise even reached port. When she arrived the next day, the harbor was a graveyard of burning ships. Arizona, Oklahoma, West Virginia, all gone. The Navy that had ruled the Pacific was crippled, but Enterprise was untouched. By sheer luck and timing, she became one of only 3 American carriers left afloat. From that moment, her story became the story of the U.S. Navy itself. How it survived, adapted, and fought back. First blood. 3 days after Pearl Harbor, Enterprise's aircraft hunted down the Japanese submarine I-70 northeast of Oahu and sank it. It was the first confirmed U.S. naval victory of World War II. 2 months later, on February 1st, 1942, she struck the enemy directly. Her task force raided Kwajalein, Vocha, and Maloelap in the Marshall Islands, Japan's outer defenses. 3 ships went down, 8 were damaged, and dozens of aircraft were destroyed on the ground. Japanese bombers counterattacked, but every bomb missed. For a navy still reeling from Pearl Harbor, it was a statement: we can hit back. The Doolittle Raid. On April 18, 1942, Enterprise sailed beside Hornet to escort 16 Army B-25 Mitchell bombers on a secret mission, the Doolittle Raid on Tokyo. Her fighters provided air cover as the bombers took off from Hornet's deck and disappeared toward Japan. The raid caused little physical damage, but its psychological effect was enormous. For the first time, the Japanese homeland had been bombed. The Empire of Japan was not invincible. That message came from the flight decks of Enterprise. Midway, the turning of the tide. 2 months later came Midway, June 4th, 1942. The Japanese launched 4 carriers to destroy America's remaining fleet. Enterprise, Yorktown, and Hornet were waiting. At 7 a.m., Japanese planes hit Midway Island. American bombers responded in scattered, desperate waves. Most never made it back. Then, at 10 a.m., Enterprise's dive bombers, led by Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey, found the enemy fleet by chance, following a lone destroyer's wake across the open ocean. They came out of the Sunday. In less than 5 minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Kaga, Akagi, and Soryu, were hit by a storm of 1,000-pound bombs. The explosions ripped through hangar decks filled with fueled, armed aircraft. By nightfall, they were burning wrecks. That afternoon, Enterprise's planes struck again, crippling the last carrier, Hairyu. When the battle ended, all 4 Japanese carriers lay on the bottom of the sea. Midway changed everything. Japan's offensive momentum was gone, and Enterprise had been at the center of it. Eastern Solomons, the first test. By August 1942, American Marines were fighting for their lives on Guadalcanal. To protect them, Enterprise met the enemy again at the Battle of the Eastern Solomons. Her aircraft sank the Japanese light carrier Ryujo and damaged several cruisers, but Enterprise herself took 3 direct hits and 4 near misses. 74 men were killed, 95 wounded. Fires raged through the hangar bay. Yet damage control teams under Lieutenant Commander Herschel Smith contained the flames and kept her afloat. Within hours, she was launching planes again. 5 weeks later, she was back in action. Santa Cruz, the last carrier standing. In October 1942, Enterprise faced the Japanese again at the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands. Hornet was sunk, Saratoga still under repair, and Enterprise was the last operational American carrier in the Pacific. 2 bombs tore through her decks. 75 men were wounded, 44 killed. Every rule said she should withdraw. Instead, Smith's teams fought through smoke and flooding, welded plates over gaping holes, and kept her flying. By battle's end, Enterprise was the only American carrier left afloat in the entire Pacific. The Japanese called her the Grey Ghost because she always returned. She would live up to that name again and again. Guadalcanal and the 4-day miracle. Weeks later, still under repair, she went back to sea. From November 12th to 15th, Enterprise's aircraft fought non-stop above Guadalcanal, sinking the heavy cruiser Kinugasa, the battleships Hiei and Kirishima, and 7 Japanese troop transports. Her pilots flew until their eyes blurred with exhaustion. Her Seabees welded while bombs fell nearby. When it was over, the Japanese offensive collapsed. Guadalcanal was saved. 1 damaged carrier, 1 damaged control officer, and 75 construction workers had changed the Pacific War. The long road to victory. Through 1,943 and 1,944, Enterprise never stopped. She supported the invasions of the Gilberts and Marshalls, struck the stronghold at Truk, and fought in the Marianas, the Philippines, and the South China Sea. At Truk Lagoon, she helped destroy more than 200 enemy aircraft and sank 40 ships in a single raid. At the Battle of the Philippine Sea, she shot down 52 enemy planes, more than any other carrier that day. At Leyte Gulf, her aircraft helped crush Japan's last major fleet action. By then, she was no longer alone. A dozen Essex-class carriers had joined her, but even among giants, Enterprise was still special, the veteran everyone looked to. Her flight crews painted the Big E across her island structure. To them, it wasn't just a nickname, it was family pride. The Night Carrier. In late 1944, the Navy asked her to do the impossible again, launch and recover planes in total darkness. Enterprise became the first fully equipped night carrier in history. Her night fighters hunted Japanese planes that slipped through the daytime patrols. Her night bombers struck airfields and shipping while the enemy slept. At Iwo Jima in February 1945, she kept aircraft in the air for 174 continuous hours, 7 days straight. Her pilots flew through storms, guided only by radar and faith in the men below directing them home. The experiment worked. The Navy would never again go to war without night carriers. Okinawa and the final blows. Then came Okinawa, the last and bloodiest campaign. Japan unleashed thousands of kamikazes. No ship was safe. On April 11th, 1945, one struck Enterprise's forward flight deck, killing 14 men and wounding 34. She stayed in formation, launching planes within hours. A month later, on May 14th, another kamikaze hit the same spot. The blast tore through multiple decks, destroyed the forward elevator, and killed 13 more sailors. Fires raged, ammunition cooked off, and still the crew fought back. They saved her again, but the damage was too great. Enterprise withdrew to Ulithi Atoll for repairs. When Japan finally surrendered in August, she was still in dry dock. She had fought in 18 major battles, survived 5 direct bomb hits, and outlasted every one of her sister carriers. The greatest ship. When the war ended, Enterprise's record was unmatched. 911 enemy aircraft shot down by her fighters and guns. 71 enemy ships sunk, 192 more damaged or destroyed by her planes. 20 battle stars, more than any other American warship. Both the Presidential Unit Citation and Navy Unit Commendation, the only carrier to receive both. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal called her the one vessel that most nearly symbolizes the history of the United States Navy in World War II. In November 1945, the Royal Navy awarded her the Admiral T Pennant, an honor not given to a foreign ship in over 400 years. No words could have said it better. Enterprise represented the very spirit of victory. After the guns fell silent, when peace came, she returned home to cheering crowds and quiet docks. But the world was changing. The Navy was building bigger, faster jet-age carriers. The heroes of 1942 were yesterday's ships. On February 17, 1947, Enterprise was decommissioned. Plans were made to preserve her as a museum, the ship that won the war. Veterans raised money, school children sent coins, but the post-war world had moved on. The funding never came. For 11 years she sat in reserve, slowly fading. On July 1st, 1958, the Navy sold her for scrap. By March 1960, the most decorated ship in American history was gone cut apart at Kearny, New Jersey. Pieces survived: her bell at the Naval Academy, her stern plate in Rivervale, her anchor at the Washington Navy Yard. But the ship herself, the living legend, was gone. A name that lives forever. Even as the torches cut through her steel, the Navy refused to let the name die. In 1961, a new Enterprise CVN-65 was commissioned, the first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier in the world. She served for 51 years, through Vietnam, the Cold War, and the Gulf War. And another will follow Enterprise, CVN-80, a Ford-class supercarrier under construction today. The legacy continues. Because Enterprise was never just a ship, she was an idea proof that determination and sacrifice could outlast any storm. From the burning skies of Pearl Harbor to the victory fires of Tokyo Bay, she stood for the courage of ordinary Americans who did the impossible, day after day, until the war was won. She began the fight. She ended it in triumph. And though her steel is gone, her spirit still sails with every ship that bears her name. The Grey Ghost fought from the first day of the war to the last, and she never lost a battle. That's not legend. That's history. When the guns fell silent in 1945, the USS Enterprise had nothing left to prove. She had fought from the first day of the war to the last, through Pearl Harbor, Midway, Guadalcanal, the Philippines, Leyte, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. She had been bombed, burned, and battered, and she had outlived every other American carrier of her generation. No other ship in history had fought as long, as hard, or as often. No other crew had done more with less. And yet, in the peace that followed, the greatest warship America ever built began to fade away. The quiet after the storm. After Japan's surrender, Enterprise steamed back to Pearl Harbor in September 1945. She carried returning air crews, repair crews, and the ghosts of every battle she'd fought. Her flight deck still bore the black scars of kamikaze hits. Her hull plates were dented and warped from years of combat. But the mood aboard was different now. The war was over. The mission was done. In November 1945, she made one last voyage to Southampton, England on a goodwill tour. There, in a ceremony unlike any other, the Royal Navy awarded her the Admiralty pennant, a distinction never before given to a foreign warship. It was the British Navy's highest mark of respect, recognizing her as a ship of historic valor. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal called her the one vessel that most nearly symbolizes the history of the United States Navy in World War II. Oh, to every sailor who had served aboard, those words rang true. But history has a short memory. By 1946, America was moving on. The war was over, and so was the Navy of the past. Jet aircraft and atomic weapons were changing everything. The new carriers under construction, larger, faster, built for a new kind of warfare, made Enterprise look small. On February 17th, 1947, after nearly 9 years of active service, the most decorated ship in the U.S. Navy was decommissioned. A forgotten hero. The Navy intended to preserve her. There were press releases and fundraising drives to make her a national memorial, the ship that won the war. Veterans and schoolchildren sent donations, but peace had brought complacency. The public was tired of war. The costs of preservation climbed, and the enthusiasm faded. By 1949, the campaign was quietly abandoned. For 11 years, Enterprise sat moored in the reserve fleet at Bayonne, New Jersey. Her decks gathered rust. Her once proud island superstructure was stripped for parts. Seagulls nested where bombers had once waited to launch. The ship that had fought through every storm now faced a slower death neglect. In 1958, the order came down from Washington. Enterprise, CV-6, was to be sold for scrap. The veterans who had served on her protested. Letters poured into Congress. Newspaper editorials pleaded to save her, but the decision stood. On July 1st, 1958, the Navy sold the Enterprise to the Lipset Corporation for $561,333. By March 1960, the cutting torches were finished. The ship that had survived bombs, torpedoes, and kamikazes was gone cut to pieces at Kearney, New Jersey. The grey ghost had finally vanished. Fragments of a legend. A few relics survived. Her ship's bell was sent to the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis, where it still rings for graduating midshipmen. Her stern plate was preserved in Rivervale, New Jersey. An anchor rests at the Washington Navy Yard. Some of her portholes, gauges, and fittings were saved by veterans who couldn't bear to see her lost completely. But the living heart of the Enterprise, the steel, the decks, the sound of her engines, the smell of salt and oil was gone forever. Captain Osborne Bennett Hardison, who had commanded her during the desperate Guadalcanal battles, rose to the rank of Vice Admiral before retiring. He died in 1959 after a car accident, just months before his ship was scrapped. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Lieutenant Commander Herschel Albert Smith, the damage control officer who had kept Enterprise alive through 5 bomb hits and 20 major battles, retired as a captain. He never received a major decoration for his work. His name appeared only in after-action reports and technical memos. He lived quietly after the war, never speaking much about what he'd done. The Seabees, who had welded her flight deck under fire, went back to building airfields and bridges. Most never told their families what they'd accomplished in November 1942. To them, they were just doing their jobs, rediscovering the ghost. By the late 1950 seconds, the Enterprise was gone, but her story wasn't finished. In 1958, as the last pieces of her hull were cut apart, the Navy commissioned a new ship to bear her name, USS Enterprise, CVN-65, the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier. When she was launched in 1960, veterans of the old CV-6 were invited to watch. Many wept as the new ship slid down the ways. She would serve for 51 years through the Cuban Missile Crisis, Vietnam, the Cold War, and the Persian Gulf. Her reactors powered her around the world without refueling, but her name carried something deeper, the spirit of the ship that refused to die. And in the 2020 seconds, that name will rise again, Enterprise, CVN-80, a Ford-class supercarrier now under construction. The Navy has promised that pieces of the old CV-6 will be built into the new ship, connecting past to future. The name will never die again. The lesson she taught. The loss of the original Enterprise was more than a tragedy, it was a turning point. When Americans realized the most decorated ship in U.S. history had been destroyed for scrap, public outrage followed. Veterans groups demanded change. Preservation movements began to organize. Out of that loss came a new idea. Historic ships should be saved not for nostalgia, but as living classrooms for future generations. Within a decade, the USS Intrepid was preserved as a museum in New York City. USS Yorktown found a permanent home in South Carolina. USS Hornet became a museum in California. USS Lexington was saved in Texas. Every one of those ships owes its survival to the ship that didn't survive Enterprise. Her destruction was the wake-up call that taught America the value of its naval heritage. Because people understood too late that they had allowed something irreplaceable to be lost, remembering the men. In 1991, a naval historian digging through archives at the National Archives in Washington discovered a forgotten trove of Enterprise records, damage reports, action logs, and crew rosters. Inside those files lay the full story, how Smith and his men had kept her fighting off Guadalcanal, how the Seabees had welded her deck while bombs fell, how a single ship had saved an entire campaign. That historian began tracking down surviving veterans. Most were in their 70s by then. Many were reluctant to talk, but when they did, their memories were sharp. They remembered the smell of burning fuel oil, the vibration of the deck under bomb hits, the taste of sweat and smoke in the air. They remembered the sound of her engines, the roar of planes launching at dawn, and the faces of the men who never came home. They remembered November 1942, when Enterprise was the only American carrier left in the Pacific, and when the fate of the war rested on a half-repaired ship that simply refused to die. One sailor said it best. She wasn't just steel. She was alive. And as long as she was alive, so were we. Why she still matters. The story of the Enterprise is more than history. It's a lesson in what keeps a nation strong. It's about engineers who refused to quit, sailors who fought fires in darkness, pilots who flew into impossible odds, and a country that found hope in the resilience of a single ship. She proved that victory isn't about perfection or invincibility. It's about persistence, the refusal to give up, even when every calculation says you should. That's what Herschel Smith understood when he patched her hull under fire. That's what her pilots believed when they launched one more mission on fumes. That's what her crew carried home when the war was done. The spirit of Enterprise. Today, if you visit Annapolis and hear the Enterprise's bell ring, or walk the decks of the museum carriers she inspired, you're hearing echoes of her story. Every time a new Enterprise takes to sea, she carries the spirit of that first one, the courage of the men who fought on when there were no reinforcements coming, no second chances, and no guarantee of survival. She taught the Navy and the nation that strength isn't just in firepower, it's in people. In the end, the Enterprise's legacy isn't steel or statistics. It's belief, the belief that one ship, one crew, one nation can endure anything if it refuses to give up. The Enterprise was more than the most decorated warship in American history. She was a symbol of endurance, ingenuity, and faith. She began the war at Pearl Harbor and ended it at Okinawa, and through every battle she stood for the same idea. America might bend, but it will never break. The grey ghost is gone, but her spirit still sails. And as long as there are sailors who look to the horizon and believe they can make it home, the Enterprise will never truly die.